welcome to the Swindon Festival of Literature, or rather the online Swindon Festival of Literature. Thanks very much for joining us, and we do hope that everything is well where you are. Now, we're both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science, and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on. Well, to go on at least online. Today's guest will say a bit about the role of radio in our lives today and in the 21st century. Then we'll have a chat about it. We'll address the kind of questions that you might ask if we were live in a theatre, but we are not. Okay, now please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature online welcome to today's guest, author, journalist and broadcaster, Miranda Sawyer. Welcome, Miranda.
Thank you. Hey, I'm imagining like loads of applause. How kind everyone is. So I am here to talk about radio, which is one of the things that I do. I have made some notes, so I hope they will make sense. And I'm going to chat for about 15 minutes and then we'll have a chat ourselves. If you can hear any pings, that's just messages coming through. Such is life.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Miranda. And if you were live in Swindon, we would also talk about your book, your writing and so on. But you're right, we'll focus on the radio today. And by the way, talking of being live in Swindon, have you ever been here? Swindon in spring is terrific.
I heard, yes, I have been to Swindon. I remember ages ago, I wrote a book in about 1999, and it was kind of about the suburbs. Well, it was about the suburbs. And I remember coming to Swindon and being impressed by, this is going to sound so weird, by the amount of mini roundabouts. That's the main thing I remember. There was loads of mini roundabouts, and I was quite into driving at the time. There was an element of kind of whizzing round the roundabouts. So I found it quite zen.
We are famous for roundabouts. We have a roundabout called the Magic Roundabout. And we're a place where roundabouts were trialled, and that's why you met so many of them.
There you go. You see, I knew this. Somewhere in my heart, I knew this. I'd come to Swindon just for the roundabout vibe.
Well, you'll have to come again. We better get
and do it properly.
Yeah.
Yes.
We better get back to topic, which is the radio.
Yeah.
And the kind of questions we want to look at is does the perpetual sound of radio, wherever we go, inform, inspire, or interrupt our best thoughts? What are the key differences between local, national, and international radio? Which of them serve us better? And this is a good question for a literature festival, can you read or write with the radio on? And how I came across you, I want the people to answer the question, do they know about Radio Garden? But maybe you'll mention it. I think I better hand over to you, Miranda. Over to you.
Okay, I will mention Radio Garden, so don't worry. Okay, so the reason why I am here to talk about radio is essentially, although I write books and I write features for The Observer, and sometimes I make radio myself, I do the occasional show on Six Music about film and music, and I interview people about those things. I am the radio reviewer for The Observer. At least that's what I started out as, which was 15 years ago. Now I am the audio reviewer for The Observer, and there's a difference. And the difference is, of course, podcasts, which I will come to. But that means essentially that for the past 15 years, every week, I have listened to a variety of bits of audio, whatever that is, across radio and across podcasts, and written reviews about them. And it means that I've listened to some things over and over and over, and a lot of new things. I do try and include some new things because otherwise I'll just get terrifically bored. What I wanted to do really with this talk is to focus in on a time that I know, it's one of the reasons why we're on Zoom now, that we've all been thinking about, which is the pandemic and lockdown. And what that did for radio, I found quite interesting. So if you write about radio and podcasts in a newspaper, you are part of a review section. And within that review section, you're actually quite low down. So there is a kind of status of culture. And at the top is film, because you have amazing stars in film. And music is quite high. Art is pretty high, because art is seen as something, incredibly worthy, I suppose, and expensive, hard to get at. And then you go down various bits of culture, and radio and podcasts are quite close to the bottom. I would say perhaps above dance, but they are quite close towards the bottom. And what happened when the first lockdown occurred in March 2020 is that radio and podcasts suddenly moved right to the top of the cultural hierarchy. So I was finding that my reviews were coming on the front of the Observer, whereas normally you have to click through millions of kind of links to find my reviews. They would be literally on the kind of virtual front page of the Observer. And the reason was that radio continued. Radio continued in a live form, and podcasts, which are obviously incredibly popular and do influence radio, they also continued because a lot of celebrities very quickly thought, oh my goodness, I haven't got any work. What can I do? What should I do? What am I any good at? I've got some famous friends. Maybe I'll talk to my famous friends. Or they might be a documentary maker, like say Louis Theroux, and he started interviewing people. So they started making podcasts. And there was a kind of liveness to radio in particular that nothing else could do other than the news. So you weren't getting live gigs, you weren't getting kind of premieres of films, you weren't getting nothing live, no dance, no theatre, nothing other than radio. And this, I think, helped people to understand what radio was kind of for, because I think it has been ignored a little bit. And what it proved during the pandemic to be really good at is the community, creating a community of radio. And how that happened, if you look at the big BBC stations, so things like Radio 1 and 2 and Six Music, all that kind of stuff, is they slightly changed the schedules so that that the breakfast show would start a little later on all those kind of stations, and they would go on for a bit longer. So you would have a familiar friend, whether that's Lauren Laverne or Greg James or whoever you preferred to listen to, that would last a little longer. Your friend would be there for a little bit longer. And they also promoted, I don't know if people remember this, but I remember it very clearly, on Thursdays at 9 o'clock, each of Radio 1, Radio 2, 1 Extra, Six Music and Asian Network, each breakfast presenter would choose a track, and then they would play these 5 tracks, but they would play them right across those 5 stations, which would never normally happen. So you had even more of a feeling of community. And it was an idea of having friends when you couldn't see your real friends. And I think that radio does this incredibly well, because either, you can listen to it just you on your earphones, although mostly you don't, you just have it kind of chuntering away in the background, but it's a friendly voice that makes you feel as though something is carrying on, even if you're stuck indoors. And partly that is to do with the structure of radio. So the structure of radio is unbelievably strong. It's always the same. The breakfast show is the biggest. Then there's drive time, even though nobody commutes anymore. There's still drive time. The structure of radio is incredibly, incredibly strong. It doesn't really change. It changes within that. And that helped people, and still helps people, feel secure. If you looked at Radio 4, for instance, during the early days of the pandemic, nothing changed. The Today programme still started at 6, it went on till 9. The only thing that changed was PM went on at 4:30 rather than 5. But what's really weird about that is that hasn't changed since I was young. I'm 54, and I can remember when I was about 7 that PM was on at 5 p.m. and Just a Minute was on at 6, and the Today programme was on in the morning. It's exactly the same. Those structures have not changed in years, and they have changed in telly. You don't get the 9 o'clock news anymore. They've absolutely not changed. So this gives a sense of continuity to people, which helps in a time of kind of pandemic. It can be too structured, I feel. It can feel sometimes old-fashioned, and I think that Radio 4 is slightly in danger of that. I do think that Radio 4 needs a bit changing. And during the pandemic, there was kind of difficulty around the Archers. So the Archers was, I'm not a huge fan of the Archers. I do apologise if you are. I only come in for the kind of drama bits. As far as I'm concerned, the Archers is just full of kind of floods and affairs and people falling off roofs. But the Archers kind of failed quite badly during the pandemic because they couldn't work out how to work out that drama, how it would be. They weren't flexible enough to make that drama work. And I think that sometimes the rigidity of the structure of how things are done in places like Radio 4 is a little bit of a disadvantage, I would say. Anyway, but within those structures that we are now incredibly familiar with, there is some freedom. And one of the things that you can indicate to listeners, despite the fact that Radio 4 hasn't changed, is that documentaries will indicate all sorts of things, what's happening in the world, how old your listeners are. So outside the pandemic, you get much more on Radio 4, perhaps documentaries about things like punk and stuff, which you wouldn't get before. But punks are older than me, so they're in their 60s. So of course they should be on Radio 4. But also what happened during the pandemic is you get very quick lockdown documentaries. 5 Live was particularly good at this. They had people reporting from the front line of the NHS, and they just gave them recorders, sent them off, made really interesting documentaries in that way. And another thing that they can do, because things are live, is during the crisis around Black Lives Matter, for instance, when George Floyd was killed in America, on 1Extra, Shawnee B and DJ Ace, who are very regular and much loved DJs on 1Extra, did an incredible live show about Black Lives Matter and how they, as Black men, are treated in everyday life, how they have to modify their behaviours in order to be able to move through essentially places like the BBC, which is their white employers. It was an absolutely incredible and very moving kind of show. And those things that can happen in radio quite quickly and without spending much money, because what you'll find on things like television is if you want to make a documentary, it'll cost a certain amount of money. And if things cost a certain amount of money, you get a lot more people looking at it. And if within radio, it doesn't cost that much. And so you get a few people listening, but not so much. And you can kind of make what you want to. The other thing I wanted to talk about radio in terms of kind of structure and your life in pandemic, out of pandemic, is that it lets you get on with your life. So if you're going to sit down and watch, I don't know, at the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was watching the Tiger King, weren't they? That if you're going to sit down and watch Tiger King, it kind of requires you to sit down and look, even if you're on your phone at the same time or wandering off to get a cup of tea, it kind of requires you to stop your life to a certain extent. What audio does is allow you to get on with your life, and it makes tedious jobs interesting. So, we were all doing tedious jobs in the first part of lockdown. If you had a garden, you were gardening. We don't have a garden. I got into ironing, which has never happened before, but ironing I found very soothing. And cooking, I'm also not a great cook, but if we're cooking, we have a chuntering in the background. Painting, I did do a bit of painting, that was good. Even going to sleep, audio will chunter away at you in that companionable way, so that you feel like you're not just doing something that's incredibly tedious. You've got input, something coming in. And there is a tendency now, particularly for younger people, I think in their 20s and 30s, for self-improvement. They don't feel like they're doing anything unless they're kind of learning while they're doing at it. This actually fed a lot into podcasts in the early days coming over from America. And that also feeds into the idea that you should be listening to stuff all the time. I think that I should talk a little bit about podcasts, even though we're talking about radio. So podcasts, essentially, the difference is, I would say that they're designed to be listened to over headphones. So radio, you can have chuntering off in the background all day. It's very unlikely to say something that will kind of scare the kids or shock the cat. But, with podcasts, with something like true crime or really rude comedy, you kind of need your earphones on. And they're much more designed to be intimate. So before the pandemic, people were listening to podcasts on the commute or when they were working out in the gym. And then once the pandemic happened, maybe it would be during their hour-long walk, or we got a rowing machine. I would listen to podcasts while working out on the rowing machine. I've got rid of it now. So, those kind of, it makes tedious jobs, again, kind of more interesting. And podcasts and radio over the last, really since I've been writing about radio, so really, but has kicked in very strongly over the last kind of 5 years, have fed off each other. And radio, particularly BBC Radio, have produced very good podcasts from existing shows, or they spin off of 5 Live, or they'll make a podcast that eventually gets you'll listen to on the radio itself. And commercial radio does this as well. I'm also, one of the questions that you asked was, can you write while you're listening to the radio? And I would say almost definitely, no, you can't. I can't at all. But I think I know a lot of people who are visual artists who are who who make things, you know, sewing and or pottery and things like that, and they quite often have radio in the background, just kind of chuntering away, and they will quite often just stick it on one particular station, whether that's Radio 4 or 6 Music, whatever they like, just keep it on and it'll just be away in the background. It reminds me a little bit of having a fire. It's just something keeping you warm. And then as writers, if you're a commercial writer, you know, if you're a drama writer, you can get your ideas made a lot easier on radio or in podcasts than you can on the TV, despite the fact that we have Netflix and all these other commercial environments. And a lot of true crime podcasts have actually been made into TV series and films as well. So there's a kind of, obviously there's a connection between writing and radio. And I have to say that podcasts, drama podcasts, have improved drama on radio immeasurably. Radio 4 drama, I have to say, was terrible for years. I mean, years, absolutely rubbish. And like everybody just kept acting all the time. It didn't sound like real life at all. And podcasts have made radio drama up its game so that it sounds a lot better. That's why The Archers failed, really, because it didn't sound as good as any of the podcasts that were out there. And finally, the last thing I'd kind of like to say, really, is there's an intimacy to radio and an international area to radio. So the intimacy to radio, I think particularly around late night radio, I mean, I've listened to it saving people's lives. Ian Lee, who had a late night show on Talk Radio, actively talked somebody out of a suicide. I heard him do it. And now Christo, who isn't actually in the same slot that Ian Lee used to have, over the pandemic has had quite a few men, lonely men, phoning in, and he talks them down and he talks them around. And these poor men they've been triggered by some event in the news. It might be something to do with long past abuse. It might be just that their wife has left them. And late night radio really can help people if they phone in. And I'm always very upset because a lot of these radio shows get shut down because they're deemed to be not as commercial as some other kind of type of radio. So they're becoming much less common they're not as common as they used to be. And they're not as local as they used to be. And I find that very sad because I think the locality sometimes of a late night show can really help people that need to talk. And then the opposite of that is the idea that there's a bigger world out there. And this is where we come to Radio Garden. So if you remember many years ago, you used to get big old radios. I've got one upstairs about this big, and you would, if you went onto shortwave, you could kind of just keep turning the radio until you found something that was in Russian or maybe French, or you'd find some spooky noises and you think it was aliens kind of talking to you. And that, for I think pre-internet people, which is me, the idea that there was a huge world out there was incredibly seductive and, you know, good for kind of languages and all that kind of thing. And Radio Garden, which is a really lovely free app that you can get on your phone, is a similar thing. So what it is it looks like a globe. You spin around the globe and you click on little lots of light, and you will get different local radio stations. And I mean, it teaches you one thing. It teaches you that there is awful music, the same awful music across the world, but also you get specialist shows in different places that absolutely open up your mind. And you know, if I want you to take anything away from this talk, other than the fact that radio is really great, please get Radio Garden on your phone and have a listen to all the different types of radio, all the different local radio stations that you can get across the world.
Miranda, brilliant. You've set us up for just what we would do in a theatre, for a good little chat. And the last thing you touched on is really the first thing I'd like to start on. Since you are a radio reviewer, you dare to say, as you already have, good and bad things about what you hear. Yeah. So how about we have a little chat about content? And, you know, you've mentioned how much you like late night people helping individuals. You've mentioned, I love that idea that radio is more like a friend when you listen to it than television or anything else. There's something intimate. You can do it while you're peeling carrots, and it's just like you're having a conversation. but what about content? And one can even dare to mention, you know, you've mentioned Radio 4, you've mentioned Radio 1 and so on. I mean, I want to mention my position and then see what you think about it. I remember old radios that used to wind up to make them go. You mentioned an old radio. So I'm a little bit older than you, so I remember this. And I now think of wind up wireless, but I now think of radio quite often as wind up. It winds me up. What's going on that you want to shout on the radio?
Yes, that's interesting. So I think that it's a little bit like a reflection of social media, isn't it? So the kind of radio that's going to make you shout at it is live radio, I have to say. And live radio, perhaps commercial radio, perhaps talk stations, which are quite cheap to run. And it's, to me, it's very much a reflection of the inverted commas culture wars that you get on social media, such as Twitter. And it's just, you know, this is what will get people talking. This is what gets people riled up, and it has happened for a very long time. I remember ages ago, like before I was a radio reviewer, I interviewed Chris Tarrant, you know, and he had a kind of breakfast show, a radio breakfast show, and it relied on people phoning in. And he said to me, you know, really, if people aren't using the phones, if they're not picking up the phones, there's 3 topics that you can use to always get them on the phone. And they were the battle of the sexes in ye olde terms, and then football. I mean, please shoot me. And the other one was annoying neighbours. So there's always been radio hosts, if people aren't phoning in, have always had certain things that they can go to, and those things are the controversial things, the things that you're going to argue about. Always. So it's not new, but I do think that with the proliferation of different news stations, that it has, I don't want to say got worse, it's got more common. There's a particular station that started off in London, is now national, LBC. And LBC, they will admit it, I've seen them admit it, I've seen the graphs that show it. LBC really, really took off during Brexit. So Brexit obviously absolutely divided the country on non-political grounds, I would say, actually. So it didn't, you might think that I don't know what you would think. I think the assumption is that somebody who would vote Tory maybe would be more likely to be pro-Brexit, but I don't think it was like that at all. I think it completely divided everybody up in lots of different ways. And the problem was, because it was a kind of yes or no question, are you for Brexit or are you against Brexit? Then it ensured that people were always going to be going hammer and tongs at each other. And LBC's listenership went up and up, up and up and up, because it was just a constant argument. And so they did another spin-off off there. They did an LBC kind of rolling news station as well. And it's to do with that. It's the easiest way. The easiest way to get people phoning in is to say, I don't know, to take an extreme position on something, and then get everybody just piling in, to use the lack of nuance. And I do find it a bit boring, but then I also think there's other things you can listen to,
No, and I think it actually cheapens lots of things that people really do think. And the presenters seem to me to become masters at wind-up. In other words, with great charm, and I could mention names, but I won't. They say, "Oh, Billy from Manchester, what do you think?" And before you know it, Billy is pouring out his heart. And then the other thing that I feel is misleading, even though radio can be a friend, it can't actually be a friend. When on Woman's Hour, they beautifully say, tell us what you think about this. They are not going to give you therapy. They are not going to they're not going to come to your house and have a cup of tea with you. It's fuel for this massive machine that goes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I think that's slightly cynical, actually. Yeah. I would say, I don't think that people in Women's Hour are kind of are trying to get people to be upset. I mean, I think that they are actually trying to get to people's lived experiences, to say what happened to you and what do you think? Or they're trying to get to their politics, or they're trying to get to the core of what they want to talk about. I genuinely think the difference is talk radio, live radio. So as television gets less and less live, especially during the pandemic, what is live? Football, and nobody's at the football. There's nothing is live. So during these past 12 months, when the liveness really is only given to you on the radio, it's not even given to you on a podcast, it's only given to you on the radio or perhaps on a live stream on something like Instagram, then people are bursting at the seams to kind of, they want to talk, they want to get this stuff out because they've got no other live area to do it. They can't go to the pub and shout at the mates. They can't go and jump it down at a gig. They've got to get all this stuff out in some way. And I think the liveness of radio is where it happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, talking about content, and you took a little pop at the Archers, but also sang its and other programs praises for getting up to date, especially during the pandemic. I mean, what about the number of stations and content? Dare one make statements about value judgments about this is good for the nation, bearing in mind that the BBC perhaps doesn't rely as much, well, it doesn't rely at all on advertising the way some of the others do. Does it behove the BBC to somehow have a responsibility to do, I don't know, educational things as well as entertainment?
Well, it did, didn't it? I mean, it did a lot of bite size on the television, and they provided a lot of kind of educational podcasts. You're Dead to Me is one, which is about history. They definitely do that. I mean, they have a kind of Reithian remit. They have to do that to a certain extent. And I think with commercial radio, there's lots of kind of weird rules around how much kind of local news you've got to give, and whether a particular program has to come from the local area. But actually, commercial radio is about making money. And you make money through advertising, and advertising, how do you get adverts? You get adverts if they know that they're going to be listened to by a lot of people. So they want a lot of people listening all the time. I mean, what I find quite interesting about commercial radio at the moment over the last few years is it's simultaneously got kind of more niche and less niche. So you'll have things like stations like Absolute 60s, which only plays 60s, but then Absolute 70s, 80s, 90s, all different things. But all that is the music. The actual presenters are the same right across. So they're all presented, the breakfast show is all presented by Dave Berry. It's just different tracks being dropped in to say this is a 60s track, or you'll get a 90s track on Absolute 90s. And I think that kind of, there were other decisions taken around, the big commercial broadcasters are Global and Bauer, really, and Bauer own a lot of different local radio stations, and there was big decisions taken that they were going to have a national heart breakfast rather than a local heart breakfast. And so they're making essentially commercial decisions because that's how they survive, really. And I don't think that they're trying to make rubbish, they're just making commercial decisions. So they're going to have a more high profile celebrity in that important breakfast slot. So that's, so they've got Amanda Holden. So that's why they make those decisions rather than, is this for the good of the nation? I don't think that that's really how they think.
No. Earlier on in your talk, you mentioned the status of radio in terms of reviewing in places like The Observer and The Guardian and so on, and everywhere. And when one goes back through history and one thinks of when Caxton came along and invented printing, and people thought that's the end of conversation and storytelling. Lo and behold, it wasn't. Then a few hundred years later, along comes the radio, and people say that'll be the end of reading, and lo and behold, it wasn't. And then along comes television, and people say that'll be the end of radio, and lo and behold, it wasn't. I'm thinking of literature, and as you were talking about the low status of radio in the papers, I was thinking literature has a similar position. The other art forms, music and so on, seem to be more prominent. Are they bedfellows, radio? In what way might they be? This is a bit of a psychological question. The sort of intimacy and the work you have to do listening to the radio to create pictures in your head.
Yeah.
Am I right to think that might be similar?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I always think, what's amazing about books is, you've got books here, right? You've got books everywhere. And look at them, they're just like little marks on a piece. I mean, it's mad. And then inside your head, they are vast worlds of adventures. You can remember where you were. It's just amazing. And I think with certain aspects to radio, it's absolutely the same. I think especially actually if you listen to something on your earphones and you're walking around or driving, maybe actually as well, when you listen to it, I often go for a walk when I'm listening to stuff, because I have a lot of stuff to listen to, and I walk the dog, and there's bits, I just go to the same walk all the time like everybody does. I walk around the same park over and over, and there's little bits of the park where certain aspects of a podcast has moved me that I will always remember this particular kind of like location of an emotional moment kind of thing. It is interesting, but I do think that there's particularly in drama, good drama, which is why I was always attacking Radio 4 drama, because it was so rubbish for so long. But when you get good drama that means something and seems real in your head, it is something a little bit like reading. There's what audio drama does very well at the moment is be quite scary. There's quite a lot of scary dramas out there on podcasts and a little bit on Radio 4. And there's a series called The Lovecraft Investigations, and they are 3 drama series which are based around H.P. Lovecraft stories, but modernized and made to sound like a modern podcast. And they are really scary. And it's just noise. It's just like the sound of some it's probably not someone falling down the stairs, but something like that, or somebody go like that. It's just, they are genuinely really scary. I've been really I can tell you where I was in the park when I was jumping up and down like that, something frightening me. And those things, yes, I do think they're slightly similar, creating worlds in your head.
Yeah. Are you going to declare your favorite radio station? I mean, and even dare to make judgments about ones that we could do without? There are a lot around. I mean, what about the number of them?
There are a lot, aren't there? Yeah. I don't mind. There's a lot of all sorts, isn't there? I go onto the telly and I think, oh my goodness, I can't get through all of this. We've got Netflix and we've got Amazon Prime for the kids, and now we've got Apple Plus, and God, there's too many books in the world. There's too much telly in the world. There's too much culture in the world, isn't there? You just have to find the things that you really, really like. So I'm certainly, as somebody who works in the media, I'm not going to say shut them all down. I'd have nothing to do. This would be terrible. There's some I can do without, but that's just me. I really wish they would. I have to say, I really wish they would slightly kick Radio 4 at the bum a bit, because it is absolutely, so important to the state of the nation. And I feel like it is slightly being left behind because its structure is so strong. I think something needs to happen to Radio 4 to just, maybe the new moves that the BBC are making to include people outside London, to make sure that the Today programme comes from outside London twice a week or something. It needs to do something, I think, to stop it. It will disappear into the world of fuddy-duddyism. And I have no problem with fuddy-duddyism, because I think it's important, but I do worry a bit about it. I think it needs something.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, maybe you'll come back and talk about fuddy-duddyism, because I know
we all become fuddy-duddies in the end.
Well, I know a scrap metal merchant and a tree fella who both listen to Radio 4 because they say they like to learn things.
Yeah.
You're guaranteed to have something that is both entertaining and informative.
And also it's a kind of random nature, isn't it, of radio? That's the difference. So with podcasts, you think, okay, this sounds like quite an interesting podcast. I will try this podcast. You're making a decision, aren't you? Whereas I think with radio, what's really amazing, if you get a station that you like, is you just switch it on. And if it's a music station or a speech station, whatever, you're right, you will learn something. You will find a new track you knew nothing about. Somebody will interview somebody that you'd never heard of. Radio 4 is amazing. Radio 4 documentaries, I have to say, I think are really, really good. They're absolutely excellent. And I know that a lot of podcast stations in America really started because they wanted to imitate the documentaries on Radio 4. So I do think that sense of kind of serendipity of learning is great. You're constantly making choices all the time in this new cultural world. So to just flick on a radio station that you quite like and they play some music that might make you burst into tears while you're doing the washing up, how amazing is that? Or like you say, you'll learn something that you never kind of thought of. And I do think that's, the liveness and serendipity of radio, as well as the companionship, I think is kind of amazing.
Yeah. And as a festival organizer, a festival of literature organizer, I love it when people tell me they got into poetry through listening to Cerys Matthews on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Or when they tell me that they got into books or even without actually reading them by listening to a radio station. And they very rarely say that about television.
Yes, well, because it's a different thing, isn't it? The visual stimulation means, I love telly, I love films, but it's a different it's a different area that you're kind of stimulating, isn't it? I mean, you could say that my daughter got, she watched the Harry Potter films before she read the books, Great. But the books are so much better. And she knows they're so much better. Once you're into it, she's like, why is this not all in the films? And I'm like, because you can't get it in the films. They'd be like 10 hours long. The books are better. So sometimes things will lead you into books, I have to say.
I mean, I think people come away from radio often the way they come away from literature festival events, arguing, discussing things, asking more questions. Sometimes people come out of films a bit bombarded and battered. I don't have a
I think the worst of films it's like sitting on a roller coaster, isn't it? They put you here, you will go up here, you will go down here. At this point you'll feel like, oh, it's a switchback, and at this point you'll cry and then you'll get off. There's no room for you in there. Yeah. And that's the joy of music and radio, isn't it? That's why everybody loves music, because it's a gift for you. You can wrap it around your life in whatever way you want. It can express the emotions that you can't express in other ways. And I think that the space to let you into a medium is incredibly important, and radio definitely has that too.
Yeah, and I think that's why it will go on whatever else comes along. Podcast.
Yeah, it always makes me laugh when people go, I really resent paying the BBC license fee and diddly. And I think, do you listen to the radio? Like, do you? Yes, you do, and it pays for that. Even if you don't like anything on BBC One, or you think BBC Two is boring. I mean, have you seen Repair Shop? Are you mad? Repair Shop is great. Then this, it pays for the radio. It's amazing.
I had a friend from abroad. I won't tell you which country because it might sound like I'm maligning that country, but she said the radio in the United Kingdom calms me down.
And the World Service is incredibly important. The World Service makes amazing documentaries. It has really good podcasts. It goes right across the world. And there was a point where it was during the kind of Cameron years when they wanted to reduce the World Service, and they did. And then to be honest, it was brought back because it was the absolute kind of epitome of, what do you call it? Soft power. So if you want to say that Great Britain is wonderful, then get people listening to its radio across the world, because it's absolutely educational. It's completely brilliant. They've made it's always balanced. It's always fair. The presenters are really great. You'll learn something. It's fantastic.
Especially because many radio stations in other countries are either commercial or political, one or the other.
Yeah, and you will get that on Radio Garden, I have to say. The other thing that's weird about Radio Garden, though, is you do get a very strong sense of the colonialism of the world. So you'll go across a bit different parts of Africa and you'll hear the main station and it will be in French or it will be in English or whatever. And you do get a very strong sense of that history of colonialism. It's quite interesting, really. But I do think that that generally, the World Service is an absolute gift. And whether you look at it from a kind of national point of view, here we are spreading the wonderfulness of Britain across the world, which I don't, I'm not sure it's quite what I think, but it's genuinely a really lovely thing that people really appreciate across the world and also feed into now. They, much more in that, it's much less colonial in inverted commas than it used to be. It absolutely has presenters from all over the world, and it talks about lots of of different experiences across the world. It's great.
Much less. It doesn't just spread the loveliness of
no, not at all. So you get this feedback, you get this wonderful kind of sense of what it's like to live in Ghana, or it's absolutely, or Japan, or it's just brilliant. I love it.
And let's end as we began, and that is mentioning, or as I began with you, which is why I wanted you to come to the festival, when you mentioned Radio Garden in such an enthusiastic way on the Today programme some weeks ago. And you mentioned the stations one could listen to. You didn't actually mention that most of them would be playing Western music. And
some do. Yeah, they do. Yeah.
Apart from the presenters, it could be anywhere. You could not quite tell whether you were in Africa or Asia or South America. But you did light upon, when they asked you for an example, a little radio station in the heart of South America, in an area called the Chaco of northern Paraguay. Why did you light on that out of the thousands that there were?
I don't know. I was looking because I was trying to get away from Western music, and I like South American music generally, so I kind of thought, I'll have a look at that. And I find it's the same thing we were saying before. It's like late night. So if you're much more likely to get interesting esoteric sounds in late night. So I thought when I was listening, I thought, okay, where is it going to be late night across the world? Because you're more likely to get something interesting. Oh, it is over here. And I just came across this station that was playing this particular kind of Paraguayan music that I didn't know about, and that I really liked. So it is, I've returned to it on a number of occasions because, like you said, the problem is that you just, you flick on quite a lot of the stations and you just get, I don't know, Taylor Swift on all of them. And I've got nothing against Taylor Swift, but I would like, that's not why I'm listening to the radio at that point. I want to find something new,
And the harp is Paraguay's national instrument. And after this is over, I'll send you maybe some examples of Paraguayan harp music. I mean, that's just terrific that you like it.
Yeah, I love it.
Now, it's been a while since you've written a book, and this is a festival of literature. Are you going to write a book about the role of radio in the life of?
Maybe I should. I'm not. I'm at the moment. I'm writing a book about long-term relationships. So God, that is really hard. But I'm in the middle of it. That's my old book there. Yeah, I put it up there because I thought you should do some kind of self-promo.
Well, immediately this finishes, it'll be on a little screen for people.
That is very sweet. But anyway, that one was about midlife crisis, and this is about maintaining long-term relationships. And perhaps the answer to maintaining long-term relationships is to go into different rooms in the house and listen to different radio stations. Who knows?
Who knows? When will that be out? Do we know yet? Or
goodness, when I finish it. So let's hope I finish it by the end of the summer. So then maybe next year, I suppose. It's really late. I can't deny it.
Miranda, long we had not talked. We built up a pile of better thoughts, as Wordsworth said. We could go on, but we have to stop now. From the Swindon Festival of Literature, many thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's been so lovely. Thank you so much.